Imagine this situation. There is a runaway trolley heading towards 5 people working on a train track. The trolley will kill them. However, in front of you is a lever. Pulling this lever would divert the train onto another track. But there is one person on the other track. Would you pull the lever and sacrifice this one person to save 5 people's lives? Most people answer yes to this trolley dilemma. The philosophical reason is a utilitarian one. This is a doctrine that holds that rewards should be maximized and costs minimized. This utilitarian analysis can be maximized by sacrificing the one person to save the 5. Now, let's imagine another situation. This time, you're standing above a bridge. A runaway trolley is heading towards 5 people. You notice an overweight man in front of you. If you push him, then his weight would be great enough to derail the trolley and save these 5 people. Would you push this man to his certain death in order to save the 5 people? Most people answer no to this footbridge dilemma. Even though the outcome is the same as the trolley dilemma, most people do not choose the utilitarian option in this case. The reason usually given is one famously outlined by philosopher Kant. He argues that we should not treat people as a means to an end. He believes that morality should be based on universal laws like these. In the footbridge dilemma, the far person is being used to save 5 lives, but in the trolley dilemma, the bystander just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Scientists have found that these different responses are based on the difference in the emotional salience of these 2 scenarios. Pushing the fat man off of the bridge engages the emotional process more than pulling a lever. The role of emotion can be tracked back to our evolutionary history, where emotion aided our survival when we needed to help others in our tribe. For a long time, it was accepted that science cannot answer philosophical questions such as morality. The philosopher David Hume famously argued that science can only tell you how something is, but not how it ought to be. But a proper understanding of the neural architecture of our moral decisions can help to explain what we ought to do. Modern neuroimaging technology, which can capture real-time brain activity while people perform a task, is used to record the neural activity of participants as they make moral decisions. This technique is used to identify neural correlates for moral decisions. Emotion plays an influential role in moral decisions. It influences moral decisions by including us in a feeling of compassion and sympathy for people. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, is a brain region in the frontal lobe that regulates one's emotional state. This region that had been studied in order to determine how emotional responses correlate with activity in this region. One study compared patients with VMPFC lesions with patients with unrelated brain damage and neurologically normal patients. Their brain activity was recorded using functional magnetic resonance imaging while they were presented with 50 hypothetical personal and impersonal dilemmas. Remember, personal dilemmas, like the footbridge dilemma, evoke emotional responses, and impersonal dilemmas, like the trolley dilemma, evoke cognitive processes. All the groups choose the utilitarian action for most impersonal dilemmas. For example, most would choose to press the lever. The brain damage comparison group and the normal group choose the utilitarian option a lot less for the personal dilemmas. For example, they did not choose to push the fat man off of the bridge that much. However, patients with VMPFC lesions still chose the utilitarian option for most personal dilemmas. This is because the normal patients and the patients with unrelated brain damage responded emotionally to the personal dilemmas. But the patients with the VMPFC lesions did not respond emotionally, and so they were more likely to choose the utilitarian option. This finding suggests that the VMPFC is needed to make normal, moral decisions. The importance of the VMPFC is highlighted by studies on psychopaths. Psychopaths lack empathy and are egotistical. They have reduced amygdala and VMPFC activity, meaning that they do not respond emotionally to things. They are more likely to choose the utilitarian option, such as pushing the fat man off of the bridge, than normal people. Emotional responses do not operate alone for these moral decisions. Cognitive processes are also affected by these emotional responses. What happens is the emotional processes in the brain compete with these cognitive processes. To test what happens in the brain during these situations, a group of experimenters recorded people's neural activity as they responded to personal and impersonal dilemmas. As expected, they found an increase in the emotional regions of the brain, such as the medial frontal gyrus, posterior cingulate gyrus, and the angular gyrus. The important finding was that the middle frontal gyrus and the parietal lobe, regions involved in working memory, decreased in activation as these emotional regions increased. This suggests that the emotional responses overpower their cognitive processes in dilemmas that evoke a lot of emotion. Sometimes, difficult decisions need to be made. In these cases, the emotional responses need to be overpowered. What happens to the emotional responses and the cognitive processes in the brain when these difficult decisions are made? To determine what happens, difficult personal dilemmas are used. These dilemmas bring emotion and reason into conflict. They achieve this by offering a utilitarian benefit for committing a morally abhorrent act. For example, in the crying baby dilemma, imagine that you are hiding underground with other civilians. Soldiers have invaded your hometown and they have orders to kill all civilians. Your baby is crying very loudly. You realize that his crying will alert the soldiers. If they find you, then they will kill you and all of the other civilians. Should you smother him in order to save everybody? The rational decision is to smother him because then everybody would survive. If you do not, then everybody would be killed. An easy personal dilemma is one where there is no utilitarian benefit for committing a morally abhorrent act. This type of dilemma does not bring emotion and reason into conflict. For example, there would be no reason to kill your baby if you did not want it. To explore what happens during this conflict, participants were presented with difficult and easy dilemmas, and their neural activity was recorded. Increased activity for responses to difficult dilemmas was found in the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. This is a region involved in cognitive conflict. The ACC detected the power struggle between the emotional aversion to the act, such as smothering your baby, and the rational understanding that everybody's lives would be spared if you do so. Increased activation was also found in their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, and inferior parietal lobes, regions involved in abstract reasoning and cognitive control. Abstract reasoning reflects the utilitarian nature of calculating rewards and costs, and cognitive control reflects the power needed to override the emotional responses. Do these cognitive processes favor utilitarian judgments? The neural activity of participants was looked at, but only for responses to personal dilemmas. Would these cognitive processes increase in those who choose the utilitarian option for these emotionally charged dilemmas? If they are based on utilitarian judgments, then they should increase in activity for people who chose the utilitarian option. These cognitive processes were indeed activated when participants chose the utilitarian option. This means that these cognitive processes reflect a utilitarian decision-making that works against emotion. These cognitive processes are needed so that we can override our emotional response and make the correct choice. The ability to make rational moral decisions develops through age and experience. But does this mean advancement to the cognitive processes in the brain? No, it actually involves the VMPFC, an emotional region. The VMPFC was earlier shown to be needed in order to make normal moral decisions. When children are very young, their moral decisions are based on an egocentric concern for themselves. They are selfish and only care about themselves. As they get older, their moral decisions start to become more empathic. The VMPFC is a critical region that is needed to learn moral norms and appropriate behavior. Patients with early VMPFC damage were compared with patients that had late VMPFC damage. They responded to easy and difficult personal dilemmas, and their neural activity was recorded. Patients with early VMPFC damage chose the selfish, self-interested option more than the easy dilemmas compared to those with late damage. For example, they were more likely to choose to kill their annoying boss and to evade paying tax. The patients with the earliest damage chose the self-interested option even more. Patients with VMPFC damage before the age of 5 chose these self-interested options more than patients with damage after 5. This shows that an intact VMPFC is needed to reason properly. Without it, judgments become irrational and self-serving. Going back to the is-ought question, we can now attempt to answer the ought question which science has long been prohibited from answering. Sam Harris, a famous neuroscientist, has attempted to address this issue. He believes that morality can be a subject of scientific inquiry. He argues that there are right and wrong ways to construct a society. For example, it is wrong to kill people for witchcraft because this is an erroneous belief. For him, the teleological purpose is what our moral decision should be based on. This means that intentions and the end result is what counts the most. Applying this to moral decisions in the footbridge dilemma. If we do not push the fat man, then more lives would be lost. If our purpose is to save more lives and produce a better outcome for all, then doing nothing would result in the worst outcome. Inaction is still a choice. If our goal is to produce a better outcome for all, then we would need to overcome our emotional responses in order to make the correct choice. Emotion is the only force stopping us from making these decisions, and these responses are universally present in normal populations. It could be argued that psychopaths have the ability to make the correct decision because emotion does not cloud their moral judgments. I would argue that emotion is an archaic mechanism that can sometimes cloud our judgments and result in a worse outcome for all. However, we are not robots, and a certain degree of emotion is what makes us human. What we need to do is learn to detach our emotional responses from the cognitive processes that determine our utilitarian judgments. I believe this will result in a better society for all.